We are recording. So the webinar will be recorded for future views, and if you need to step out, you will find the webinar on our brand new YouTube channel, and more information on that will be coming. So having said, this is our first webinar. I just want to make sure that everyone crosses their fingers. So far, so good. Although I see that there's a few settings that I may have missed. You'll let us know if it seems that everybody can hear us, because I don't see anything in the chat about not being able to hear. So we're off to a good start. And let's see what comes next. This evening, I am just delighted that you're going to meet two individuals who I would be happy to sit down with and have a chat any day. These gentlemen have been great mentors to me and for the Rocktown History Mission, but they also have such interesting experiences and interests that I just think we're in for a treat. I will introduce our guest host, David Ehrenpreis, and then he will introduce our featured speaker, Eric Wilson. Before that, I will say that we'd love to hear from you. You are filling up the chat. We'll keep an eye on that, but also the Q&A would probably be better for questions to our presenters. Let's see. Guess we'll get started. David Ehrenpreis is our guest host this evening. He is a past Rocktown history trustee, a professor of art history at James Madison University, and director of the Institute for Creative Inquiry. He created the beautiful and rich in history Picturing Harrisonburg book and exhibition project several years ago. His current book project is entitled Dying for the Nation: The Life of Monuments and the Burden of History. So for everyone, thank you for joining us. Welcome. And I'm pleased to start our conversation on Archer Alexander and the Faces of Freedom by turning the virtual mic over to David Ehrenpreis.
Great, thank you, Penny. Pleasure to be here, and pleasure to welcome Eric. Eric Wilson has been the executive director of the Rockbridge Historical Society since 2012. His teaching career has taken him from his alma maters of Harvard and Boston College to Norfolk Academy, Washington Lee University, and Rockbridge County Public Schools. He's a founding board member of the Portsmouth Colored Community Library Museum in Portsmouth, Virginia, and of the Miller's House Museum of Transportation and Industry in Lexington. And he continues to consult on a variety of public history projects, exhibits, school curricula, community planning, and commemorative programs in the region and across the state. And our plan tonight is Eric will talk for about a half an hour, and then I'll ask him some questions. We'll have a conversation, and after that, I'd love to have you all ask questions, and you can put those questions in the chat, and we'll continue the conversation with the full group. And I think with that, I'll turn it over to Eric, and we can start with your presentation.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Penny. As I set up the screen here. And yeah, questions into the Q&A will go. I think Penny will field them. The easiest way to see those and build on that. But very glad from the other Rock County in the Valley, from Rockbridge, to be joining in this series. Excited to have a lot of people here and to work with this format, presentation, conversation, and exploration in a common goal of public history. So there's two core parts to what I'll do tonight. There's really three, but a third will, I think, come out in the Q&A. More about monuments today and attitudes about them and how we think about them. The first part is going to focus on Archer Alexander. And I know we have at least 2 descendants of Archer Alexander in the room tonight. Particular welcome to that, and thanks for your input, and to the other historians who've helped shape that. But we're also, I don't know, I think you can see my cursor if I'm circling. Is that right, David?
Yep.
We have Archer on the left. We have the memorial here as well on the right, and contemporary responses. And we want to hold those 2 perspectives throughout the night. Work at the Rockbridge Historical Society. This came out through a number of different ways, but I just want to cue you to our website. We have a local Black Histories series, of which this is a part. You see some other elements of that which we've presented recently, and again, a couple participants in the call have helped with these sites. The importance of descendant history and oral histories are really important on this kind of work, and I just want to continue to emphasize that moving ahead. All these slides you can find at our website. I'm going to click through some pretty quickly so we can, meet some time marks and then move through there. But follow up there, and you can revisit them, find more of the details. Archer Alexander, you see here in 3 different images, and we're going to talk a lot about different types of imaging, different ways of seeing people in different angles. And we see different names here, both for Archer Alexander, the other person who's figured in that memorial, a more familiar name. But I just want to say that names matter a lot when we talk about not only individuals in history, but also in memorials. Particularly, I'm often going to refer to Archer Alexander as Archer, simply because there are lots of other Alexanders in the mix, okay, and it can get confusing. There are no other Lincolns other than President Lincoln or Abraham Lincoln or Abe Lincoln. But I think when we think about how we memorialize and whom, the names matter a good deal. Here are the 2 memorials that I'm going to build to. I really want to compare and contrast these 2, which as you look at them, you should see 2 different angles, and they should look a little different. Looking up diagonally from one, looking in, out from the other. How do they tell different stories? Whose stories are they telling? That's what we're going to build to. So I'm going to start with a little introduction that was written for written context for a newspaper that I think will quickly move through Archer's life, give you the arc of a biography that helps understand how this person came to this stage. Okay, we're not going to talk about Lincoln much, but I want to introduce people to Archer Alexander so that then we can understand how these 2 bronze memorials came to be and how people understand them differently. Okay. His name is Archer Alexander. You won't find either name on his statue in the nation's capital on the left or the one in Boston, even on their plaques. But now his name echoes resonantly again in Rockbridge County in Virginia, across America. He was born here in the Valley in 1806, enslaved. In August 1829, he was taken west in an 800-mile, 5-family caravan, moving from the nation's largest slave state, Virginia, to its newest, Missouri. In February 1863, he made the decision to free himself. He acted. He ran away to Union forces, foiling a plot by Confederate sympathizers who sabotaged a railroad bridge. He saved scores of lives. After the Civil War, right before the collapse of Reconstruction, he would rise up. And that's where this monument brings us. Today is 15th of April. It is the anniversary of Lincoln's death. Lincoln was assassinated on the 14th of April, 1876, died the next morning. And that was the dedication date of this statue. So when we look at this memorial, the presence of Lincoln matters deeply. And I want to emphasize the presence of Archer Alexander and of emancipated people generally in this. There are different ways in which this memorial has been described. If you look on the plaque in DC, it's called Freedom's Memorial. In Boston, it doesn't appear on a plaque, but the ways they've discussed it, it's called the Emancipation Group, right? It focuses on multiple figures. Freedmen's Memorial, the multiple people who raised the money and helped bring that into being. Sometimes it is referred to as a Lincoln Monument. In the bill currently before Congress, in committee, it's called the Emancipation Statue Removal Act. We'll come back to that. So the names of the statues and the memorials and the monuments are different, not just the people. Again, I think that's well worth considering as we move ahead. If you aren't aware of where this is, a little hard to see, here's the Capitol, here's the White House, and here, this little dot over here is Lincoln Park. So about 12 blocks, I think, east of the Capitol. Lincoln Park is in sight of the Capitol, in sight of the White House, in sight of Ford's Theater. In DC, the Lincoln context matters quite a bit. I want to cue here a website. Doris Kievan-Franke is on the call, and Archer Alexander, this site will give you a great wealth of detail from which I'm drawing some of the details and other sources. Encourage you to look there for a wider range. A few core facts. Here's the arc of the life. You know, much of the 18th century, you know, right beyond Reconstruction is his death. He's born in Rockbridge County, born to enslaved parents named Alec and Chloe. Alec Alexander, owned by Archibald Alexander. Again, the Alexander names, you know, pile up, and that's, you know, for clear reasons of ownership. Alexanders have great standing in the county. Alec and his son Archer and other members of the family become part of that property chain that helps sustain that authority and capacity within the county and beyond. Here you see, this is Washington College, just to give you context. Washington College hiring out enslaved labor. This is part of the labor market. This is not the same John Alexander who is owning Alec and Archer, but I think goes to show how wide that web of family influence, connection extends in this county, and probably representative of many other areas. Alec Alexander was said at one point to be too uppish. I think the word proud comes up. There's an anecdote, this is told by Archer's biographer, a later account of his life, that he talked about people being free because of the Declaration of Independence, these kinds of things, that it's not just that there was a property sale for pure profit, but there may have been a spur because of this you know, kind of desire to step out of one's station. So when Archer is in his teens, his father is sold, and soon after Archer is taken west, his mother dies. So many ways in which families are separated through enslavement, certainly in other ways as well, but just want you to have that sense here. 1829, let's take that as a benchmark here. There's property transfer for Archer. He becomes enslaved by a new owner, but this is the emergence in common American accounts of Andrew Jackson's presidency and Jacksonian democracy. What does that mean? To whom do those values, those ideals signify, or for whom are they possible? Here's some of those kinds of concepts, okay, within which we can read these personal histories. And here is an account, and again, I'm drawing a lot off Doris's account, who draws off a journal transcript that is in Washington and Lee's archives that really goes kind of day by day about how this caravan moves from Virginia to new economic opportunities, family opportunities, in what we would call the Midwest, but at that time would have been the West. 55 people, it's a fairly sizable caravan, half of them almost enslaved, different ages, through families drawn together. You're bringing families together for protection, strength, advice, opportunity, but families are broken along the way too, by death. You see one enslaved child was left en route near Louisville, okay, and we'll revisit that. We can think about why that might happen or how these kinds of choices happen along the way. Just to give you some rough sense, here's a map. 717 miles today. We're told that's 237 hours marching by Google, but a couple months in that movement, just to give you a sense that ultimately we end up more or less in the St. Louis area. Okay, there's a movement around there as well as in Virginia. Archer Alexander and his future wife Louisa are part of this caravan. They're owned by different families, families who marry one another, have different kinds of ties to one another. Louisa is a wet nurse on the journey, in part because she has an infant of her own, along with Archer, as well as a child of her owner. When they arrive in Missouri, okay, they're owned by different families. They work to maintain their ties, their communication, and we'll get to his escape in just a moment. I'm going to skip over this letter, but it's a remarkable letter. You might want to go back and see it, about comments about Lincoln, pretty interesting. She dies soon after emancipation. Archer remarries. He dies in 1880. And what I want to stress here, focus on here, is William Greenleaf Eliot. He becomes the person who takes Archer in. He helps pave the legal process toward emancipation. And through his political position in the Western Sanitary Commission, will be the one who helps, actually personally promotes Archer as the face of that memorial. So here's a picture of Eliot, founder of Washington University in St. Louis, their home. As I said, that's a story of how they get to Missouri, but also to look back to the descendant stories. The child who was left in the Louisville area was named Wesley, and Wesley's descendants would include both Muhammad Ali, you see here, and Keith Winstead, you see here, when Keith and Doris Kievan-Franke visited a couple summers ago. Okay, so there are different ways of finding this information and extending these stories ahead. How does Archer get free? In large part, he gets wind of a sabotage plot. A bridge had been, the timbers had been cut through. Archer finds his way to Union sympathizing guards. warns them of that so that the Union train doesn't come through and crash and cost the lives of many. Once that's done, he's got to get out of there. And there's a very interesting story. You can find out more on the website. He gets captured, he escapes, he gets to St. Louis, he finds protection. But it's at that moment, this is the key thing, that I would say he frees himself. There are legal terms by which he is not fully freed under the Fugitive Slave Act or the Emancipation terms, but the effort to do that, he frees himself, and that will become crucial in terms of why he is recognized and why he is valued in these American narratives. Some other different ways you could explore here about how people find their way to freedom. In Missouri on the left, Rockbridge County on the right. Again, I encourage you to go back to these slides and read that. I know it's small print. I'm trying to stay in a lane to move ahead to the memorials here. But here's the key point. Okay, in 1865, April 15th, Charlotte Scott, pictured here on the left, gets word that Lincoln has died. She was enslaved. She grew up in Virginia as a slave. And by this point, she is free in Ohio. And she gives to her former master, who she's still working for. So she's been freed, but there's still a kind of social relationship between their work relationship. She gives him $5, what is said to be the first $5 that she made, and says, I want a memorial to be developed to Lincoln. So her desire really is a certain kind of Lincoln memorial. But I want you to see that when this goes into place, it's called the Freedoms Memorial. It's a memorial to a concept, right? A memorial to a principle. Clearly, Lincoln is crucial there. Charlotte Scott is mentioned there down here. Archer Alexander is not. But this is how this comes into being, okay? And from there, there will be thousands of dollars given by freedmen and women. Many veterans of U.S. colored troops were crucial contributors. And all the funds for this memorial in Washington, D.C. came from freed people. And I think that's a critical consideration when looking at what this particular memorial is, who's involved, who matters. These are all funded, or this is all funded by free people and veterans. Who shaped the events when this was dedicated? Okay, it's not just the funding, but you have people like John Mercer Langston, the first Black congressman from Virginia, is one of the key organizers. Frederick Douglass is the dedicatory speaker. And you have somewhere between 25,000 to 100,000 people coming to this park, right, in Eastern Washington, to dedicate this new memorial, again, on the anniversary of Lincoln's death. So it's, again, very much to Lincoln, but also to freedom. There were some early models of how this might look, how this might develop. These did not happen. They were too expensive, or they didn't meet the standards of the committee. You can see very classical, allegorical kind of statue, and a certain progression of slave to laborer to contraband within the war to a Black soldier for the Union Army. You'll see that pattern fairly commonly in different memorials of the era. Here's another one. What you're looking at here, I believe, if I remember right, the Library of Congress has a sort of wax or clay model of this, incredibly elaborate. If you can make it out up here, you see Lincoln signing the Emancipation Proclamation, right? So that's the kind of key capstone of that. There were some revisions here There was a model of a freedman kneeling at Liberty's feet that was thought to be too submissive. The next draft said, why don't we put Frederick Douglass there? Will that work better? Okay, but at the same time, this didn't happen either. Too elaborate. Meanwhile, a sculptor named Thomas Ball had been at work on a model, you see it here at the left, of Lincoln and of a freed slave. And then this will be the second model. This is ultimately what gets cast and erected. Okay, but I want you to see these two differences. Lincoln really doesn't change. The plinth with Washington and the fasces on it doesn't change. But the slave, the emancipated slave, the rising figure has some significant changes that I want us to focus on. To zoom in here, it's a little blurry. This draws very much from classical traditions, not just of sculpture, but certain rituals of how slaves were meant to be emancipated, that you assume a certain position and then step up. These are sort of leather fetters that are snapped here. We've got the Phrygian cap, which we may recognize more in a 18th century revolutionary context, right? So it's being rendered in a certain tradition of classical liberty. But Eliot, who knew Alexander because he took him in, right, and he worked with him to, fight certain legal fights and advance the cause of the war and then the post-war efforts. This face, I think you can see here, is a pretty good model here of a particular face. Again, the name is not, on the pedestal, it's not on the statue. But when we know that this is a particular face, when we know that this figure was chosen because he freed himself in ways that that previous model didn't, that was just a type, that matters. Okay, that matters. Or it can be made to matter more, I think, as we look forward at these. Eliot recommended a particular person. We see that face happen here. And here again, from different angles. I like this picture because to me, this is a pretty dynamic angle. There are angles, and actually I'll go back. This angle is not a particularly strong, uprising kind of angle. If you look at this, I think you see that the right hand's going up, the legs are empowered, right? The shoulder muscles are flexed, the head is moving up. It's a very fair argument that there's agency in this figure. I understand there's all sorts of other kinds of hierarchy and power, but let's not lose sight of that. Let's not lose sight of the fact that the shackles are broken here, and it's not Lincoln who did that. It's the muscles here that that figure that kind of action. A lot of text here. The key thing is that in the late 1860s, this is the moment of the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment, right? The political empowerment of Black Americans. But by 1876, that's going to be rolled back. The 1876 presidential election happens the fall after the statue goes up. And it's that election that is the death knell of political reconstruction. And I think that's worth considering here. So the statue goes up still in a moment of emergence of that, but after the brokered election, the deal that gives Rutherford Hayes the presidency and also takes federal troops out of the South. Questions of authority and racial power change radically. Frederick Douglass, again, dedicates the statue here. You can read these more fully. There's been a lot of attention to both his speech, which is on the left, which is equivocal about Lincoln, but fairly, positive about the event, and that we're celebrating this statue and freedom. This is a letter to the editor, to a Republican newspaper that follows. And here he makes some adjustments. He doesn't say we need to get rid of the statue. He says we might add something, right? He actually makes some recommendations that says maybe Grant should have some more attention, right? Grant brought us the vote. Douglas is all about the vote, 15th Amendment. Okay, he's little careful about Lincoln. He had two sons who fought in the colored troops and said, they were the emancipatory figures. 5 minutes, sounds good, David. So you can see him saying the Negro here, though rising, is still on his knees and nude. What I want to see before I die is a monument representing the Negro, not couchant on his knees like a four-footed animal, but erect on his feet like a man. So do we want that as a separate site? Do we want it next to this figure? There is room in Lincoln Park for another monument. This is an argument for monumental addition rather than revision or removal or adaptation. It doesn't mean that's the only way to go, but that's what Douglas says here. I think Douglas has been misread by a number of accounts recently that say Douglas says this should be removed. We can talk about that in a few minutes, but that's his letter. I encourage you to look at it. Again, the question, what would we want to be there? An erect figure who is a runaway, a soldier, or someone who is specifically identified. Let's choose one person and name him, Archer Alexander, and tell you his story. So, back to that model, I just want to stress, I think if we specify Archer's history, that changes something. It doesn't change that he's effectively nude. It's deeply problematic. It will never change the fact that we will always recognize Lincoln, and most people will never recognize an anonymous person who isn't, noticed on a plaque. But I think there are ways to keel attentions to different understandings and attitudes. This is the Boston version. Again, you can see it's fairly similar, but it's got a different pedestal. A race set free and the country at peace. Lincoln rests from his labors. There's nothing about Charlotte Scott. There's nothing about Freed People's Funds because it wasn't funded that way. It was funded by a museum director, a museum of fine arts in Boston. A couple years later, 5 years before the very famous Saint-Gaudens statue of the 54th Regiment. This is right in front of the Boston Common. I'm sorry, it's on the Boston Common, in front of the Capitol. This is just south of the Boston Common, but it's hidden away in a bunch of hotels and office parks. Right? It doesn't have that monumental status. You can see here, this is the Boston Common, and it. That statue's down here. The 54th is up here. One of the most famous poems in American literature is written about this statue, not about this one. Read that poem. It's a great poem about monuments and what people got when they didn't ask for it. Boston Arts Commission recently voted to remove the Boston statue. And you can find out about the reasonings for that. We can talk about that in a few minutes. Here's a picture on the right, December, I think it was 29th, yeah, of that being taken down. The pedestal still stands. They're waiting to figure out what to do with that space and where this statue might go. And that happened right about the time that the Moses Ezekiel statue of Professor Jackson was taken off the VMI post and will be moved to the Newmarket battlefield. Stonewall Jackson, I should say, as noted there, but Professor Jackson on post. So I think this will be the last slide for where we're at now. But just to signal, if you can see here, is a nicely framed photograph, right? We've seen this picture, what, 15 times over the past half hour? And it looks very different with people in front of it or without. Sometimes it's symmetrically framed or angled. As of last summer, there were calls for this statue in DC to be removed. That came with the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement generally, certainly in the specific spur of protest after the death of George Floyd. And Congressman Eleanor Holmes Norton has a bill in Congress to remove that. A complication here is this is on federal land. To remove this or make any changes involves the National Park Service. Boston is through the city. VMI is through the state and the foundation. Richmond will have city and state jurisdictions as well. So when we get to the questions of communities and how those decisions are made or who makes them, those are key as well. But I really want you to just think about how one object, same object, can look differently in very different contexts. And does it matter? Does it matter? I'll pose it to you. Whether you know that the face of that figure is Archer Alexander. David? David, I can't hear you.
Yeah, sorry about that. Thank you, Eric, for that very interesting talk, which brings up all sorts of questions. Since I'll ask a couple, and then I think you've already asked a really interesting question of the audience as well. I must say I did not know before this talk that there was a specific model, and there is something really fascinating about that shift between the kind of classical Phrygian cap, which is sort of the Roman slave freed paradigm, which goes back a long ways, and the shift. And I think that there is a real strangeness about this conflation of allegory and specific figure. So, it's like if you look at the Statue of Liberty, yeah, you're not trying to figure out who that is because it's liberty. And clearly in this case, one of the questions I wanted to know more about was the relationship between, I had a historical question and then a more general question. The historical question is about the relationship between Eliot and Ball, and also wondering about the Western Sanitary Commission and basically the conditions of the commission. How much influence did the freed people who contributed have to say in terms of here's what we would like, and were the changes made because someone said, hey, I mean, clearly Eliot pulled a lot of weight, and who enabled him to be the one to go to Ball and say, hey, I've been thinking, maybe not a Roman slave, I actually have a person. That's right. One question. And then the second question is that clearly you can't have an allegorical figure who's specific. So it's impossible to actually put his name on the thing. On the other hand, clearly Eliot felt very strongly that this should be a specific person. And so that's a very interesting dynamic. And I'd like to know more about the conditions of the commission and like how Eliot made that case and presumably influenced Ball.
Yeah, let me try to, I think I'm going to start with something to go back and come back. The question about allegory or type and specificity is, I think, really important. I do think that sometimes specific figures become allegories, right? I mean, I think there are plenty of specific statues that we look to and we think of them. We look at the Lincoln Memorial and we don't just think of Lincoln, we think of freedom, right? And we know we're looking at a specific figure and that stands as an allegory. Or maybe,
well, no, I wouldn't say that's the same. I mean, that's a monument of a specific person. It's not something that is incarnating an idea. And this monument is about slavery and emancipation. It's not about a particular individual. It's about the idea of emancipation. And there's something really interesting about that shift between classical type and then specific, but not specific. That's really intriguing.
Yeah, I guess all I'm saying is sometimes we look at a particular person and we think that's a statue of victory, right? And maybe allegory is not the right word, but it goes from specific to a general principle. As to the question about Eliot and Ball and the Sanitary Commission, Eliot was one of the leaders of the Sanitary Commission. There were several figures, including other figures related to Rockbridge, Fremont family, Jesse Benton Fremont, and Senator Fremont were also part of that. So I think you're right to say that there is a power brokering group. I have no evidence that the popular input from freed people or from white people who also were glad about emancipation or Union victory had any input on how this was figured. Certainly didn't see Ball's study and do that. Whether it was Eliot's, recommendation, Ball, why don't you do, we need to, uprise this figure or not, I can't say, but certainly it was Eliot who gave the photograph. So Alexander didn't, model in person for this. Alexander never saw the statue. Eliot talks about Alexander's reaction to knowing about that and seeing it and sort of being wowed, but that's all in Eliot's words. So there is, I think I hear you sort of noting, who has the agency for how these decisions are made. Does Archer even have a voice in it? It doesn't seem to be the case. And Eliot knew Ball, right? So, Eliot had some prior relationship. Just learned, thanks to Doris, recently, that he meets him over in Europe, and Ball knows Kimball. I mean, there are these kind of art relationships, and this well in your work, that there's a certain kind of, I don't want to say insider's game, it's not quite the right phrasing, but a set of patronage relationships,
Sure.
funding expectations that are happening in their own right. But I will say, to me, it is an utterly remarkable fact that these Freed People's Funds and the initiative for it, I don't have, the Charlotte Scott story is a really nice story, right? It almost seems a little too good to be true that, woman, she said to die at the age of 109 and die back in Lynchburg. There's some of this, that, but I don't see, it is absolutely true. However, the fundraising went within U.S. colored troops to raise that money is remarkable.
Sure.
David Blight really makes the point too, that don't overlook that commitment, that social commitment, and don't overlook Frederick Douglass's commitment to that statue. It can be changed, in his mind and other minds, but I would not say there's an absence of Black voice in this.
Sure. And that brings us to the second question, and I want to make sure we have time for some questions from the audience too. And that is, you know, monuments are created at a particular moment, and they are kind of an indicator of the understanding of history and society at that particular moment. And as you well know, and as we move forward in time, and understandings change, the monuments stay the same. And this is one of the big challenges with monuments. There's one scholar who actually talks about how every monument has sewn into it, with its creation, its own destruction. Like, there's gonna be a moment when there's just this disjunction between the way people thought and the way people think, and that's just the way it is. And we're clearly in this moment of racial reckoning, and as advanced as in some ways as this monument was, you know, there are now strong arguments that have to do with the way we feel now and the way we think now. And I'm wondering how we mediate those needs. And then we could get further, but I think we probably won't have time, in terms of, okay, if this is no longer representative of the way people think about race and power today, what do we do? What do we do with it? Do we have public spaces that are filled with monuments that at one time made perfect sense and now have represent that kind of challenged relationship? So it's obviously a very difficult question, but I think given this topic, it's one we have to address.
Yeah. Let me come at that in two ways. So we got Boston. Boston, as I noted, has removed it. They removed it, and we're kind of waiting to see what the plan was. They wanted to do studies and conservatorship, and we could find a museum, we could find a site. And the city of Boston is now determining that. And it looks like that may be going, that statue, the bronze cast, may be going back to a site in Missouri with a certain community-based tie to that. Okay, and that's playing out. The question of whether that object should be visible in public space or a curated museum space is an important question. I was reading, you know, the fun language of Congressman Norton's bill today. I hadn't realized that in the language of her bill, she wanted removed and not to be in any publicly visible space. Okay, so Boston has made the decision. We'll think about different options, and I've consulted with them, and we talked about, does Virginia make sense in some ways? Does a Lincoln site, you know, presidential site make sense? Does Missouri make sense? There are different ways to go with that. Okay. As of now, DC stands. I will be surprised if this moves. I mean, just the jurisdictional legislative process. I would be surprised if that moves through the park system, you know, unless it's, you know, a popular protest that brings it down, right? And those have happened too. I would note, I wanted to show this in terms of context and change. This is 50 years ago, right? Mary McLeod Bethune. This is in the same park. And this is what, 200 yards. And when this statue went into the park named for Lincoln, they actually turned the Emancipation Monument in order to look at this, right? So they then understood this as a larger group. So I think the idea, and we could agree or disagree, is now that we have different visions of freedom. Freedom by an educator, a suffragist. We have unnamed children here in the way that we have an unnamed emancipated figure. Like, how do you free yourself? Would it matter if we knew this was actually, you know, a specific young girl or a specific young boy? Maybe it would, or maybe it wouldn't. Do we read this as, I don't know, a tribute to her or an allegory of education and freedom? I would say both. I mean, that's my understanding of about.
And it's interesting. It's interesting that that monument does exactly what Douglass wanted, right? That instead of having, finally here is an African American who is standing, which is what he was calling for when the other monument was created.
Yeah, and he wasn't calling for a woman or children, but this supplied that, right? And
sure,
that adds to it.
So let's turn to the audience. I see a bunch of things in the Q&A, but not a whole lot of more comments than questions. So if people have questions, if you can put them in the chat, that would be great. One person does note and I was thinking the same thing here, that you know, the St. Gaudens statue which you showed, which even when I was in grad school 20 years ago or so, was always thought of as a kind of a great example of actual portraits of African Americans, which you rarely saw. In fact, it even contrasts to the one you showed a little bit, because he's very carefully had people model. He did careful portraits of these figures. But as someone points out, you know, if you saw the movie Glory, and if you look at the statue, you've got the white officer on the horse and all the black soldiers marching. Now that is historically accurate as well, but the question of how these power relationships are
look at this quote, because I think that's true. And 100 years later, I mean, this is what, you know, almost a centennial, Lowell's very famous poem. I mean, this is as much a memorial as that statue. That monument, this is, you know, not quite in the busing moment, but this is the height of civil rights and, you know, Boston's own, you know, reckoning with racism then and since. That monument sticks like a fishbone in the city's throat. That is a powerful statement of what monuments can do.
Sure.
Right? They can inspire and they can stick in your throat. And then this question, there are no monuments to the last war here. I mean, that's about, I don't know if that's about Korea or World War II, but he's writing this during Vietnam. So, I mean, this whole sense that these, as you note, keep being revisited. It's a word I emphasized, revisioned and revised throughout. I don't know how that can't keep happening. How you act on that, you know, those are community decisions, I think.
Yeah, and it'll be very interesting, of course. I'm sure many people are thinking about Richmond at this moment, and the fact that the speed with which this kind of shift can happen, both in terms of, I mean, it is interesting that the Candy Wiley statue, which you see on the left, actually has many of the same things we're talking about, right? Like the question of how do you create a statue of a young Black man. Candy Wiley's solution is he's in Brooklyn and he sees someone on the subway and he asks him whether he'll model, and he uses specific people as models, and that becomes a sort of basis for what's clearly supposed to be a kind of universal figure for, I mean, forget someone standing up. He's now finally a Black man on a horse.
And he's pulling the horse in the way that Stewart isn't actually.
Right.
I've been thinking about this a lot. He's a stronger figure on the left.
And it'll be fascinating to see now that I would almost guarantee the Virginia Supreme Court will say that the city of Richmond does have, the state of Virginia will enable Richmond to take down the Lee statue. That ruling is probably going to come this summer. But what happens to all of those spaces, all of those pedestals? At the moment, Monument Ave has 4 empty pedestals, and I would bet they're going to have a 5th. And the question of Lee and that disjunction that we were talking about, interestingly enough, I was talking to Eric yesterday, and the Valentine Museum, the big museum in Richmond, has agreed that they will take the Lee statue, but only if it is in its current condition. It is not to be cleaned. It is not to be restored. It is a historical monument the way it stands now. And they're willing to have it be a part of Richmond history the way it is, but not the kind of scrubbed clean version of the past.
Yeah, and where do you put that? I mean, that doesn't go inside the Valentine. That's museum.
No, it does not.
And you know, the Valentine's actually developing other annexes, but it's a key question. It was interesting watching Boston wrestle with this. Like functionally, there's the ideological question or the political, cultural, aesthetic question about what do you do with a statue like that. Then practically,
yeah,
someone who might show it sometime, or you know.
And it's interesting to think. I mean, Allison notes that the dynamic of the ball statue just cannot be construed as representing freedom, even if it did at the time. Now it simply does not. And you know, it's interesting to think of that statue and the Kennedy Wiley, because of course the Kennedy Wiley is our vision of emancipation now. That's the way we think of emancipation today. And it's a young Black man with dreadlocks and a hoodie wearing Nikes. And one of the really interesting things—
and acting before anybody knows it, right? It's rumors.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah.
Don't you think?
And thinking about the notion of that same question of the tension between an individual and an idea, right? Which is exactly what's going on in the ball. And it's not that Kennedy Wiley has the name of a particular person on that statue. It's supposed to stand for an idea.
You don't think that's going on with the Lee statue? An individual and an idea?
Oh, I do. I just, well, yeah, no, certainly it is going on with the Lee statue. I mean, that's a representative of every single person who fought in the Confederate Army.
Right. Just like that's where I was going with the Lincoln Memorial. It's like, of course we know it's Lincoln.
Yeah,
but bigger than that. This is bigger than Lee.
Yes, absolutely.
I think Kennedy Wiley's model, unnamed, is bigger than those particular Nikes, right? And so
yeah,
that,
although still anonymous, right? I mean, there's a difference between a sculpture of a particular person and
sure,
a sculpture of
but it's sort of a third ground, right? I mean, Statue of Liberty has none of it. You know, Freedom's Memorial has some of it, right? Mark some identity, Charlotte Scott.
Sure.
You know, the way that Eliot will publish a biography of Archer that notes that, right? It makes that. I don't know the name of Wiley's, you know, model or the children in the Bethany, you know, sculpture. But now that I do know Archer Alexander's name, and we have the capacity to add that to the story, I think that has a pretty radical possibility of changing the way we look at that.
I think you're absolutely right. Well, I think we're over time. If people have a last question or last thought, you can put it in the chat, but I think otherwise we'll probably turn it back to Penny, and we can give a virtual applause for our guests. Thank you so much, Eric, for the presentation. Really appreciated it. Very interesting. And I'll turn it back to Penny.
Thank you.
Just add one thing before you close, because I'm just looking at Q&A and I'm seeing interesting things about descendants and such. And I want you to write to RHS. I want you to write RHS at rockbridgehistory.org to share this in case it goes away.
We can keep it.
Okay, good.
It'll be here until the thing's shut out. So you'll see it.
We won't shut you down. And I've just so enjoyed listening to you. You know, it's always my job to interrupt conversations, it seems, but thank you to you both. felt positive that there would be some great interaction, and I appreciate your time. I appreciate everyone listening. I do have just a couple of closing notes here. I'm going to share my screen. If you've appreciated this program, I certainly hope that you will like and follow and share our Rocktown History Facebook and Instagram accounts. We've always been offered, I see some extra Q&A coming in, so let me just double check on that. Oh, thank yous, all thank yous. Everybody's so polite. Thank you. So I'm going to share my screen because tonight, instead of suggesting a pay-as-you-go kind of a donation sort of thing, we have actually a more exciting opportunity. And let's see if I can pull it up on my screen here. Next week is the Great Community Give here in Harrisonburg and Rockingham County, and we have some challenge grant funds. So anybody who's enjoyed this conversation, I would ask you to consider donating just a small gift of $10. If we could get 200 people to give $10 between 5 and 6 o'clock next Wednesday, it would be an opportunity for us to unlock almost $3,500. So that is a huge bonus. And it's a nice stretch to think about getting that. So if you're considering, supporting us in some way, we would appreciate that. If remembering next Wednesday at 5 o'clock is challenging, you can give now. greatcommunitygive.org. Let's see, what else? Oh, I hope you will register for next month's Third Thursday talk. We have 2 men coming from the Virginia's Department of Historic Resources. David Edwards and Randy Jones will be talking about Shenandoah Valley architecture. You can see from log cabins to drive-ins. I've seen a longer description of the talk, and I think it will cover a lot and be quite interesting. So certainly appreciate your attendance there. And I will also say that thank you. An email should follow tomorrow. So far, I think the recording is working. So hopefully, fingers crossed, everything will go well. We so appreciate you being here this evening. I will say good night. Stay curious. Keep appreciating local history because history matters. Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful evening.